and welcome back to the Knights of Christendom. I'm your host Frank, and tonight I got a very special guest with me, calling it all the way from Canada, Pete Pedrozzini, and he joined us. Hey, Pete, what's the name of your vlog again?
The Catholic Northman.
That's right, the Catholic Northman. And Pete joined me here on Knights of Christendom along with Connor from the Epic Sagas of Christendom a couple months back, and we had a great conversation. I invited Pete back, and he was gracious enough to accept my invitation. And, you know, tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we got an interesting topic. We're going to be talking about Catholic prophecy, and I think this is more relevant than ever before, because I know in the United States there's a bit of craziness going on after this election. And there seems to be, in my opinion, Pete, a diabolical disorientation, not only all over the world, but specifically in America. I'm sure in Canada you have some similar stories, as it's vastly liberal out there. And I think, you know, for us Catholics, in many respects, we look at those outside of the church and they're trying to figure it out in a materialistic sense, in the material world. You know, they're trying to, get their politics straight and, elections and all this stuff. But for we Catholics that have had the Holy Mother and various other saints warning us about these troubled times coming down the path because of this great apostasy, there seems to be an insight and in many ways a sense of calm that Catholics have more than other people. You've studied the prophecies of really the last few hundred years. I know you have. You're very astute to those topics. What do you think is going on here in the world right now? Things seem to have gone mad. And how do you think that relates to the prophecies of Our Lady and other saints?
Well, I guess specifically to Our Lady of Fatima, I think what we're seeing is we're reaching the time when communism is about to attempt to take over the world. Our Lady said that the errors of Russia would spread to the rest of the world, and that means everywhere. Nobody's excluded from that. And I think we're seeing that what's happening in the States with the way, like you said earlier, the Democrats are reacting, inflaming things, not trying to calm the people down. It's a play to continue into this. We're seeing our churches being shut down. Many prophecies say that the churches will be shut down. They'll be closed during these times. And we've also got Sister Lucy's warning from 1929 that basically said that what would happen in the next 100 years. We've got less than 10 years, less than 9 years before something may happen. So I think we're seeing the culmination of that. And I think things are going to get a lot worse before they actually get better. But I do think they will get better.
That's interesting, because I too have been following lots of Catholic punditry over the past few days because of the nuttiness that's gone on in the world and in our government right now. There seems to be a consensus right now concerning Catholic prophecies that the entire decade of 2020 is going to be a mess. And it's only going to get worse year after year after year. And I do believe that we are in chastisement territory at this point, just as Our Lady has been warning us and a few other visionaries. Of course, the world doesn't care to listen to Catholic prophecy, mainly because it has to deal with man's fallen nature and rejecting sin in that sense. And we live in a post-Enlightenment world, a post-classical liberal world where we have redefined the concepts of man, fallen nature, and sin, and we have allowed it through the concept of secular liberty. And man's passions have been completely inflamed to the point where we're out of control now. We're out of control. We have a culture that's absolutely decimated. The family is in utter ruins, and the political systems are abjectly corrupt, and the chickens are really coming home to roost at this point. You bring up Fatima. Our Lady warned us of Fatima. But I think, you know what I like to ask you, Pete, is that, kind of like the chicken or the egg argument here, because as I read the prophecies, Our Lady predicts all this coming down the pipe. She predicts World War I. She predicts World War II. She specifically said how God will forget about France and Italy for abandoning the faith. I think we've clearly seen that in a couple of world wars and the apostasy in deeply held Catholic nations. But I think it's a situation right now, Pete, where you look at these prophecies and you're like, they're all coming to fruition right now. What's it going to take for people to figure this thing out and begin to maybe give some credit where credit is due?
That's a good question, and I've been thinking about that a lot lately. And in the part of the world I live in the province that I live in Canada, Alberta is very wealthy. We have a lot of oil and gas reserves. And what I've seen over the last, say, generation is this accumulation of wealth by people building huge houses, people dropping out of high school in grade 10 and getting $80,000 a year jobs. And suddenly that's all come crashing down. And I think the first step is that their wealth has to be taken away, not by the government, but they need to have things put into perspective. They need to have things, they need to see things like our forefathers did, where times were hard. You had to work hard to put basic things on the table. You know, life was a struggle. It wasn't all easy. And that's the first step, I think, is that people need to get back to being honest, poor people. And once they've reached that, then they're going to start getting on their knees, because we're seeing here in this province, people who can't make their mortgage payments are committing suicide now. Probably they're being called COVID deaths, but either way, you know, people they have nowhere to turn except to turn a gun on themselves or to turn to God. So I think we're approaching that just by the mess that we've got ourselves into in general with wealth. I think that's step one.
Okay. Okay. And to get back to a point that my mind slipped there for a moment when I said the chicken or the egg argument there, Pete. What I was going to ask you was, you know, we live in a material world and we see everything through the prism of the material world. And we believe that oftentimes politics is the answer. And in many respects, I know in America, politics is our civic religion here. But you know, we could go through the sort of the nuances of history and politics. But I think one of the things we see in the prophecies of Our Lady specifically, but also a few of the other visionaries, is the message that a lot of this stuff actually starts with the church, and an apostasy that would start at the church and then will infiltrate down into the rest of the population. Now, again, chicken or the egg? Is it the political system and the culture that causes the apostasy in the church, or is it the lack of faith in the church that begins to resonate down into the rest of the population and all of the sort of the human institutions that we have to deal with? We know that the third secret of Fatima has never been fully released. We know we have other visionaries that talked about an apostasy within your church. You take an apparition like Our Lady of La Salette, where there is some dire messages there. And listen, stipulation here about prophecy, okay? They can be tricky, and the church is always very reluctant, you know, to make judgments, but it has on some of them, but other ones have mixed messages, and it really takes experts. I don't claim to be an expert on Marian prophecies or Catholic prophecy of any kind, but I think just by looking at all these prophecies, we can kind of get a general consensus. For example, you know, in La Salette, you know, she was specific where she said Rome would lose the faith and would become the seat of the Antichrist. Now, Pete, that's interesting right there, because our Lord said that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. And here we have a situation where a lady talks about Rome losing the faith. And I think we could point to some anecdotal examples that suggest that there's problems in Rome right now. Chicken or the egg? Does the apostasy start at the top of the church? Does it start in the church, or does it start, in your opinion, at sort of the material level of the world?
I think it starts in the church. And over the course of centuries, I think we've had this conversation before about the Protestant Reformation kind of really being the start of all this liberal thought. We just let it go. And as we progress in the centuries, we rely more and more on politics and economics to drive what we want. We start to forget about the faith. And then we care only about what we can get out of this life. And that brings us to, you know, past classical liberalism and into modernism, where, you know, you can basically just pick and choose, like a cafeteria Catholic, what you want to eat from that table. It's just I feel like I can be 99% Catholic, and there's that one thing that I don't agree with, and I have a clear conscience about it, and I'm going to walk away from it. And this has gone on for so long now that I think the general population of Catholics really believes that stuff. So I do believe it starts in the church. And of course, in order for the church to be infiltrated, the government then, or the political sphere then, acts to get involved with that. And I think that the communists did get involved into infiltrate into the church prior to Vatican II, um, probably in the 1930s, 20s, something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I know when you go back to the 19th century, the 1800s, there was not, I believe it was Freemasonry was condemned by the popes, written about more than any other topic of that century. The Freemasonic, sort of infiltration that was to come, not only in the world, but also the church. And the popes explicitly wrote about this. Of course, we have the document of the Acta Vendita, which, exposes the plan of the Freemasons to infiltrate the church and affect this trajectory and how it teaches. And quite interesting enough, we're at a time and age where we got a church that now teaches not necessarily the true faith, but rather this, this brotherhood and human rights and all these things. Really, in many respects, that Catholicism really never preached or taught, at least in that direct capacity, because it sounds more like quasi-Marxism or socialism of some kind, Pete.
Yeah, and I think that Freemasonry, or communism rather, is the child of Freemasonry.
Yeah.
It's just an evolution over time of trying to get, a group of men trying to find a way. They know it's going to take a long time. That video you shared with me there with Kennedy Hall, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, he mentioned in there about being able to take over an entire people just by changing the way they think. And that process takes time. It takes centuries, or at least many generations to accomplish. And so here we are, Freemasonry, then communism in the church, plus modernism. And we're at a point now where anything goes, and it's all about just having, freedom for what you want to do.
Yeah. Let me read here from the American Society for the Defense of Tradition, Family, and Property. Let's start here with the apparitions of Our Lady of Good Success out in Quito, Ecuador. I've covered this topic before, and it's a prophecy, Pete, that's so wow. It's amazing. It's for our time. And so it was a message that was that Our Lady hid for some 300 years and finally revealed it in our time to give us sort of an indication. Here are some excerpts from this, and it really highlights what the modern world has become. And it says here, during the 15th and 16th centuries, Our Lady of Good Success appeared in Quito, Ecuador, to a Spanish nun whose little known but extraordinary life has a direct connection with our days. The Pope's infallibility would declare a dogma of the faith by the same Pope chosen to proclaim the dogma of my Immaculate Conception. He would be persecuted and imprisoned in the Vatican through the usurpation of the pontifical states and through the malice, envy, and avarice of an earthly monarch. Unbridled passions will give way to a total corruption of customs because Satan will reign through the Masonic sects, targeting the children in particular to ensure general corruption. Unhappy the children of those times. Seldom will they receive the sacraments of baptism and confirmation. As for the sacrament of penance, they will confess only while attending Catholic schools, which the devil will do his utmost to destroy by the means of persons in authority. The same will occur with Holy Communion. Oh, how it hurts me to tell you that there will be many and enormous public and hidden sacrileges. In those times, the sacrament of extreme unction will be largely ignored. Many will die without receiving it, being deeply deprived of innumerable graces, consolation, and the strength in the great leap from time to eternity. The sacrament of matrimony, which symbolizes the union of Christ with the church, will be thoroughly attacked and profaned. Masonry, then reigning, will implement iniquitous laws aimed at extinguishing the sacrament. They will make it easy to all live in sin, thus multiplying the birth of illegitimate children without the church blessing. Secular education will contribute to this scarcity of priestly and religious vocations. The holy sacrament of holy orders will be ridiculed, oppressed, and despised. For in this both the church and God himself are oppressed and reviled, since he is represented by his priest. I'm going to stop there because it goes on. It just lays out, again, the 19th and 20th century. Could have Our Lady actually have been more accurate about what we've all been living through here, Pete?
I don't think she could be more accurate. We're seeing this all right now. I mean, the elderly being deprived of extreme unction because of COVID. Pope Francis talking about the civil union of gay marriages. There's your sacrament of matrimony. People being deprived of the Holy Eucharist. Now you can just sit at home and watch Mass on TV, you know. It's all coming to a head right now. They're all working together. All those little things are just starting to poke through the surface. And I found something kind of interesting that relates to that too. It was actually, so St. Pius X, and he had a vision that he said, I saw one of my successors taking to flight over the bodies of his brethren. He will take refuge in disguise somewhere, and after a short retirement, he will die a cruel death. The present wickedness of the world is only the beginning of the sorrows which must take place before the end of the world. So St. Pius X, if you don't know, he was the one who drove modernism underground. He was aware of modernism in the church prior to him being pope, and he drove it underground by placing good instructors into the seminaries, good headmasters and whatnot. Now, literally decades after that, the very beginning of Vatican II, John the 23rd says this: we feel we must disagree with those prophets of gloom who are always forecasting disaster as though the end of the world were at hand. And then he goes on to say, in the present order of things, divine providence is leading us to a new order of human relations, which, by men's own efforts and even beyond their very expectations, are directed towards the fulfillment of God's superior and inscrutable designs. And everything, even human differences, leads to the greater good of the church. So he's saying that men's own efforts are what's going to lead us into the next age or of Aquarius or whatever, you know, and human differences are going to lead to the greater good of the church. Isn't communism based on tearing down to rebuild? So again, 50 years later, John the 23rd is doing an about face and saying the exact opposite of what St. Pius X said, as well as instilling a little bit of communism into Vatican II, I think. So I don't know if I'm getting to your original question or not, but so I'm seeing that, I think we're here at that time. I think like Our Lady of Good Success talked about, was hiding that mystery for 300 years only to be revealed in the 20th century is very important. And I think that if you take a good look at what she's saying, you can see that where we're heading. You know, I'm starting to I guess that's about all I got to say about that part.
Okay. See, it's interesting you bring up John the 23rd because, you know, listen, the West has been going, you know, to the far left, let's call it now, for the past 250 years. Okay. And you can argue all the way back to the Protestant Reformation. You go back 500 years. But, you know, it seems to be getting progressively faster, this hard move to the left. Call it communism, call it Marxism, call it socialism. I don't even know what it is anymore because it pops its head up a little different in different regions of the world. But in the end, it's total control of people's lives and the destruction of the family and destruction of the faith. Our Lady of Fatima gave Sister Lucy one secret, well, three secrets, but the third one, it was not supposed to be revealed to 1960, which fell really in the responsibility of John the 23rd, Pope John 23rd, that you just mentioned there. And the world waited for that secret to be released. And John the 23rd, according to Malachi Martin, said he opened the envelope. Malachi Martin said he saw the secret. I don't know if that's true or not, but he was one of his secretaries apparently. And when he opened it and he read the third secret of Fatima that was supposed to be revealed to the world, I believe he said something to the effect of this. This message is not for my pontificate. And he put it back in the envelope, put it back in the vault. And that secret has never been released ever since then. Now, some people have speculated, Pete, they've kind of figured out what the message is, and that is this apostasy in the church. And so that's what some Catholic pundits. But what is interesting to me is, and I don't know if this is a coincidence, but 1960 is the year that the world really started to go nuts. It was in America. It was the presidential election of John F. Kennedy, television, color TV, rock music. I mean, 1960 took us from like that greatest generation era to pick an American kind of side of this. And in 1960 began the sexual revolution. I believe the pill was made over the counter in 1961. Divorce was legalized right there in the early 60s. A sex ed, taking prayers out of school, and eventually abortion. Something happened in 1960 that changed the trajectory of our civilization. And I'm just wondering here, as a kooky guy that believes in prophecy, if John the 23rd's reluctancy to reveal that secret, in some ways, was he being disobedient to Our Lady, and did that launch us on this extreme fast path to total corruption of morality and civilizational decline?
Well, I think that probably it was a case of I need to pass the buck, because probably whatever the third secret contained, if we knew it exactly, was contrary to Vatican II. So it's not good publicity to reveal that right at the opening of a major event in the Catholic Church. Yeah, exactly. I don't even want to call it a council, but okay. And, so I think that you're right. I think the 1960s accelerated everything. I was talking to my wife earlier about some things, some ideas for this. And I was thinking back, I was watching that Kennedy Hall program that you sent me there. And as he was talking, I was thinking back to when I was in high school in the 1980s and what they were teaching us in social studies, which in Canada is like history, I guess, in the United States, and other courses that were kind of like social type courses. And they were telling us things like, you'd better not have more than 2 kids, and you should use contraception. And if you don't, you're harming the planet. And by the year 2000, there's going to be 10 billion people on the planet. That never happened yet. And it's probably best if you don't have any kids, because we have to save the planet. And if you were one of the kids that questioned that, you got shut down by your teacher. And I'd say 2/3 to 3/4 of your fellow students would mock you. And us farm boys, the ones that came from out in the country and into town, we were the ones that were like, I don't know about this. This doesn't seem right. We had different lifestyles growing up. We didn't watch MTV because we didn't even have TV, or we had one channel and Dad was watching the news and we couldn't watch anything else. We were outside building stuff or working. The town kids were inside watching MTV and getting up on all the latest fashions, and they were being absorbed into this kind of culture faster. So looking back on the 80s and how things progressed into the 90s and 2000s, seeing gay marriage become legal here in the early part of 2001, 2002, something like that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You just keep seeing the left slide farther and farther left, and the conservative or right kind of slide with it, in a sense where if you're a conservative today, it's like you were a liberal in the 90s. It's just a total mess, and it was accelerated at a great speed. And even Saint Anthony of the Desert, one of the great church fathers from the 4th century, had a prophecy. He said, "Men will surrender to the spirit of the age. They will say that if they had lived in our day, faith would be simple and easy. But in their day, they will say things are complex. The church must be brought up to date and made meaningful to the day's problems. When the church and the world are one, then those days are at hand, because our divine master placed a barrier between his things and the things of the world. Doesn't that sound like Vatican II to you?
Yeah, yeah, I know. It's definitely problematic. And me myself being an '80s generation kid as well too, I remember the decade very vividly. And it's funny because oftentimes in this political discourse, we like to blame sort of that 1960s generation for bringing about the sexual revolution, our parents' generation, and things like that. Now, my parents were in Sicily at the time, and they didn't participate in that. Southern part of Europe, Sicily was still very Catholic, very conservative, and so so by the time they got here in the early '60s, they didn't participate in a sexual revolution of any kind, and that's how one of the reasons why I maintained my faith is being a first generation Catholic. But I think, Pete, I think we could look at our generation of the '80s and what our parents started, we took to the next level, to be honest with you. We really, really turned sort of the culture on its head with sort of sexual license and materialism and every form of vice that the church has ever condemned. Now, of course, we were raised by that '60s generation, a lot of us. And so we just kind of, we kind of built off what previous generations do. When you look at today's generation, one of the things that scares me and why I believe they're so liberal and why the future is so bleak, because today's generation, with the exception of a few homes and a few Catholic families left, they are the first generation to be raised without any religious formation in their life. I can't imagine going forward that's any good. An entire generation without the proper understanding, not only of the church and truth and the gospels, but without the sacraments in their lives, without the understanding the proper sacramental nature of marriage and those graces that God gives us through communion. Baptism is being denied everywhere, as Our Lady said at Quito. Confirmation, First Communion, all of it. We got generations growing up without it. I don't know what holds our passions or this generation's passions to account going forward, Pete.
Yeah, and you're right, Frank. I think that our generation did take it to the next level, and I've seen it. Even though I've seen a few of my friends from that era have long-lasting marriages that are still married to this day, by and large, our generation was the one that brought the divorce rate up to around 65, 70%. And so you got these kids that are growing up mostly without dads.
Yeah.
And you see the behavior that they were allowed to possess now, because now they're university students, and these children of ours, our generation, they scream and they have temper tantrums to get what they want. And I can only imagine that they grew up in some kind of situation where their parents allowed them to do that, or maybe there wasn't even a parent there because mom had to work or something like that. It's destruction of the family first, and then you destroy everybody. You destroy everybody else that follows because there's no support from anything.
Yeah. And I think that's what Our Lady talked about in Quito. I think that's what she talked about in a few other apparitions as well, too, of this impending moral collapse that was to come. But, she also promised that there would be a point of restoration at some point. Now, what does that restoration look like? And I heard an interesting theory today, Pete, and I'm still thinking about it. I'm not decided on it because, we just went through an election here in America, and those of us that are more in the integralist camp and more religious, we supported, tepidly, softly supported Donald Trump because, we don't want, we're trying to avoid the complete takeover sort of the Marxist kind of universe. But, one thing I'm hearing right now is that for the restoration to actually happen, for the Catholic world to be rebuilt, that we actually have to go through a process of communism again. Now, I do believe communism is here. Worldwide communism is here, as in that Kennedy report there, that Fatima Center video that I sent you that talked about how global communism now dominates the world. I think it's clear, and I think it's here in America as well, too, just like Sister Lucy predicted. But it's a theory that I'm working through because if you look at how the faith was preserved in the Eastern Bloc, it had to go through the purge of communism. Maybe because people have to learn the hard way. Maybe that's nature, like you talked about. Maybe we just have it too easy, too comfortable. We lose our humility, which is a great Christian Catholic virtue in that respect. But do you think that Americans, Canadians, and really everybody in the West, do we have to go through this great purge of suffering before we get it and our faith is awakened? Or is there any salvaging the current classical liberal world of, ecumenicalism and tolerance and diversity, Pete?
Well, in a word, yes. We are going to have to go through suffering, and we're going to have to go through a lot more of it. I hate to say that because I don't want to suffer anymore. I'm sure you
See,
don't either. And
that's the thing.
but
Yeah.
because I kind of look at it in a different way too, and you probably do. I don't know. I've been a Catholic for a long time, and living that life in a modern world is suffering because you can't do things that everybody else can do, and it costs half your salary to put food on the table, et cetera, et cetera. I think that, yeah, we need that suffering. That's the only thing. And I believe that's generally how God brings people back around all the time, is through suffering. So, yes, we need that. What's it going to look like?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Frank.
No, Pete, let me interject there for a moment, okay?
Yeah.
Because those on the political right, the classical liberal rights, and I heard this the other day, a few days ago, on the Rush Limbaugh show, big talk show host out here. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of him. And he's got terminal cancer, and God bless him. We'll pray for him. But he talked about how he's found his relationship with Jesus Christ. It's sort of this Protestantized notion of finding Jesus and having a relationship with him, which we Catholics will say is an incomplete relationship, and we hope he finds Christ. But his notion, I think this is one of the things that the political right talks about, is that our job is not to embrace suffering, unlike we Catholics believe. Our job is to try and overcome suffering in this world. And this is what the classical, since the Enlightenment has offered. No need to suffer when we can use ingenuity, we can use economics, we can use prosperity to alleviate as much suffering as possible. How would you answer that?
Well, generally speaking, I think talking to people that are on the right, conservative right wingers like that have that kind of line of thinking, you can't ever get through to them. They've just been, they're going to have to go through it and find out on their own. I think that's just how it's going to have to happen. There's no talking points that you can bring to them that makes sense to them. I work with a lot of people that are like that. They're conservative right wing, I guess you could say. But they question my lifestyle, like, oh, we're going to run out of land to produce food because there's going to be too many people on the planet, and you've got 8 kids and you're not helping things. And they've got this mindset that they're locked into. And I don't see how, like, without direct intervention from God, I don't see how they're going to break that. And perhaps that direct intervention from God is just going to be more suffering, and maybe it's going to be particular, maybe it's going to be customized for each person. But I guess you can't really answer that. You can't say anything to them because they won't listen. That's my final answer.
Well, see, I know, and I understand that frustration, but it also shows you that they've lost the faith and what the dictates of human history and our ancestors always taught, and why our ancestors' civilization was much more strong culturally and much stronger in regards to faith. And yet here we are in the midst of this great sort of classical liberal civilization that promises prosperity and wealth and all this stuff, and yet we've seen the decimation of the political system, the culture, and really the family and the individual at the same time. We've never, we've been popping pills more than any time in history. We're using drugs, both legal and illegal, to cope with the problems of modernity. I mean, we're going through sexual partners as a way to cope with the modern world of seeking pleasure. There's so much wrong with our world, because the irony of it all is that, sure, we all want to try and overcome suffering. Suffering isn't fun, but I have not met one human being in my lifetime that's ever been able to avoid suffering, even those that claim to have been successful in this world. Suffering is is a big part of our fallen nature. And in many respects, the church and the saints have always gotten that right. And if you think you're going to go through this life just having a good time and enjoying it, you got something else coming. This is why sometimes you look at the wealthy, the elites, and while they will give you a certain face or facade in public, oftentimes their lives are chaotic behind the scenes when you get to know some of these people. Suffering, it's unavoidable, Pete. That's simple.
That's a good point, and I guess that's something you could say to them too. It's, what are you going to do when suffering comes, when it comes knocking on the door? Are you just going to complain and just make it the worst experience possible for yourself? Or are you going to offer it up? Are you going to turn to our Lord? So yeah, you're right. I never even thought of that. That's a good point.
Yeah, and also, Pete, what's that say about our Lord and his suffering, or Our Lady's, that her heart would be pierced, through her sword, as prophesied in the Bible? I mean, what does that mean in that sense? And so, listen, this is just some of the mentalities and some of the problems we have in modernity, and why we're having trouble sort of overcoming some of the fallen natures of humanity in that sense. And it's a struggle, and I think, though, Pete, it's been laid out for us in prophecy for a long time. I think if we look at a general trend of what's happened from Quito starting right around the 17th century all the way now, well, the modern prophecies, we got to be careful. Church hasn't approved those. But even if we go through Fatima and something like Akita, we see a message from Our Lady, Pete, that the world will go through this great turmoil. Again, going back to the idea of suffering, look at the world we live in. And these same classical liberals right now, in America at least, pulling their hair out over this election. There is abject misery all over the place. Even if they say themselves, they don't believe in suffering. Tell me somebody in this modern world, through the whims of the broken family, the broken culture, the rotting of our civilization, who isn't suffering? And Our Lady laid it all out and has been laying it out for 300 years. But the bottom line is, Pete, nobody wants to give up their sins. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, that and the church does not want the people to know about this. I really think whenever you bring up Fatima to somebody that's a newer Catholic, I guess, or a modernist, they gloss it over. It doesn't mean anything. They don't want to think about that. So the church has done nothing to try and say, look, we're getting to the end of an age here, and we need to buckle down, and have a good prayer life and fast more, create your own suffering for yourself. That God loves that, if you do it for him. And nobody even wants to do that. The church itself has reduced the Friday abstinence to what? I don't even know anymore. Basically, you don't have.
You get to pick and choose what you want to give up.
Yeah, I'm going to give up Coke on Friday this time, and smoking cigarettes next time, or whatever. Yeah.
Can I tell you the real damage in that? Can I tell you the real damage in that?
Yeah.
I know with me, the whole sacrifice on Fridays thing, or the no meat thing on Fridays, I never took that seriously when I was a young Catholic. And even to this day, I have trouble with it, precisely because they altered it, they changed it, they gave us a choice in many respects, and they really undercut the great sacrifice that there is there, that we offer on Fridays traditionally, that our ancestors fulfilled. It went from, okay, you got meat, but just pick and choose something else, to basically nobody actually practicing any kind of sacrifice. That's been my experience as a Catholic, not only personally, but Catholics that I have associated with my entire life. It's broken down the practice completely.
That's the whole premise behind the modern church, if you will. It's Vatican II is completely written like that. It'll tell you have to say the Mass in Latin, and then it'll go on and say, but you know what, if you don't really feel like it, we can change things up and do the vernacular if that's what you want. Or it'll say you must do this, but you know what, you don't have to if you don't want to. And it's just kind of this cognitive dissonance. You're holding two ideas in your head that are completely different, that are contrary to each other, but you have no way of picking one or the other. And you have no logic built up in no formation of logic in you to be able to decide which one's right and which one's wrong. And taking away discipline is one of those ways to do that. to make things comfortable and easy. I'm big into the martial arts. I've been in karate for 22 years, and I can tell you that discipline is something that you absolutely need to be able to get through life, and through the spiritual life even. I'm not trying to mix the two, but I'm just saying that it is a tool that you can use. But by taking away disciplinary things, making it only so you only have to fast for an hour before communion instead of 12 hours, or any number of things, even just not encouraging these practices of self immolation or whatever you want to call it, has just brought people down. It brought people down from the inside, while the things in the political sphere have brought us down from the outside.
Yeah, and so that's where we're at. It's a crazy world, and my goal has been to highlight to the classical liberals that this world is not getting any better, and their ideas have been failing now for a very long time, and to double down on what has gotten us here is an utterly stupid idea. I think the secularization of our not only our cultures and our families in that respect, but the secularization of our governments has been an utter disaster. Now, I get it. We're Americans. We believe in democracy. We bow and bend the knee to no man. But in that respect, when you look at the Holy Church, when you look at really who God is, he is a monarchy. That's what he is. He is a father. And a father's run the house. You don't let your children run the house. A father runs a home. In that respect, the government should work similar. That's why I say that monarchy is more natural. Now, I'm not a monarchist, a purist monarchist, because I get, we're living in a world now, Pete, where people want their liberty and people want to be their own gods and people want self-determination, self-governance. But there's something that's gone wrong here, because when we go to the voting booth and we have a bunch of morally degenerate people really voting at the polls, giving us governments that affect all of our lives, there's something inherently wrong with that kind of political structure, where really the weakest or the weak-minded or the morally debased get to determine for the faithful and those that have worked hard and those that have achieved and those that have been faithful how their lives are to be governed. I think we're in a situation right now where modernity has failed, classical liberalism has failed, and really democracy in many respects has failed as well too. If we don't restore Holy Mother Church, we don't restore really the dictates of Christ Church. And I know there's problems within the church. I get that, okay? And we could talk about that to a certain extent. But what we're doing in modernity, Pete, it isn't working.
No, and I was going to say something. I completely forgot. I forgot where my train of thought was going to go on this. You'd mentioned something that gave me a line of thinking, but
that's fine. Well, so I mean that's the thing, Pete. It's a troubled world, and I think what a lot of people miss, especially those that have embraced sort of this religious indifferentism, and it's something I experience a lot here. Especially in America, we believe in religious liberty, which is AKA personal moral codes through the Constitution of the United States. Okay. And we've created this new God in our minds, this abstract deist God. He's a good God. He's a God of love. He's a God of mercy. And he's a God that will never send anybody to hell. And in that respect, people have really in their own minds, not just picked and choose the God that they believe in, but in many respects, everybody's become a god unto himself in their own mind. This is what happens when you tinker with heresy, right, Pete?
That's right. And to go back again to what I was going to say before about democracy itself, is that here in Canada, I think we're advanced down the communism scale a little bit more. And, we've had this election recently where our wonderful leader Justin Trudeau got reelected again, and people were crying and moaning about it, and it wasn't fair. The elections weren't done right. Blah 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 blah. But this is the reality. The reality is that we've moved so far to the left now that the voting mass is actually that far to the left, and they will vote for him. It's not that there was some cheating. Maybe there was a little bit of tampering going on. It didn't need to be much because most of the population wants all of these things anyways. So this brings to, I'm just looking at a prophecy right now by St. John of the Cleft Rock from the 14th century. And he says, "It is said that 20 centuries after the incarnation of the Word, the beast in its turn shall become man. About the year 2000, Antichrist will reveal himself to the world."
Wow.
So how bang on can you be from 600 years ago? Uh,
I
I'm
know.
not I'm not saying the Antichrist is here. I don't think he is yet. And speaking of monarchy, I think we're entering a period when Our Lady's great triumph will bring about a new monarch.
Yeah.
That will bring about a huge change. It'll be amazing. Communism is going to seem like it's going to win, and then right at the last second, we're going to get something good and new.
Yeah, see, I tend to hold that same opinion. I think it's got to get a little bit worse before it gets better. Actually, it can get a lot worse, and I think the persecutions are going to uptick. I read one prophecy today where toward the end, toward the great chastisements, the persecution of the faithful will exceed the amount of persecution that happened in the early church. And I thought that was interesting. And I think we're starting to see that in a lot of different ways. And we'll start to see an uptick in the persecutions as well, too. So I think it's dark times, Pete. I think it's rough. I don't think the world really has an answer right now. I know many of my friends are looking toward politics as the answer, to looking toward natural means. I know there's a theory out there, for example, that these people in power, these Marxists, Democrats, socialists, what do you want to call them, they're going to overreach. They're going to push and push and push. They're going to reach, and then the people are going to rise up and respond, and we're going to take back our country and our civilization. And my response to that is, when has that ever happened? We've been on one trajectory now for 250 years without any change. Well, really 500 years since the Protestant Reformation. We've liberalized and liberalized and liberalized. And I don't see it, mainly because you have to believe that within the realm of the material world that something can be done. But in fact, those same people oftentimes forget that there is a spiritual side of the world that also governs. And this is what our classical liberal friends forget on the right, is that they believe they can solve everything through the prism of the civic religion of politics, when in fact they've omitted themselves from the religious and the spiritual element of a battle that's being fought. And that's why I go back to the biggest problem that the classical liberals have, Pete, is they've lost the faith. They may have it in some abstract way, but in many respects, that's not even true faith. It's not true religion. They've lost the faith, Pete.
Absolutely. I mean, Saint Methodius, here's another one for you from the 4th century. "A day will come when the enemies of Christ will boast of having conquered the whole world. They will say, Christians cannot escape now, but a great king will arise to fight the enemies of God. He will defeat them, and peace will be given to the world, and the church will be freed from her anxieties." It's literally going to take a miracle from God at this point. There's no human effort that can be done to change what is going on right now, unless Martians come and take over and put us under a completely different thing. Of course, that's ridiculous, but it's what's going to happen. There has to be a miracle. It's been said in so many prophecies that there's going to be a king that comes. There's going to be a holy pope that is elected at the same time. These things seem impossible right now. Like the College of Cardinals is stacked. Like Pope Francis has stacked them to a liberal degree right now, so much so that it would seem like if he passed on and another pope was to be elected, they would just easily pick one of their own kind.
Yeah.
There's no recourse to it. Like, what do you do? Like, that system is broken too. It has to be an intervention from God. And Our Lady promised that it will be through her that all of this happens. There's a knighthood that she has formed through St. Maximilian Kolbe that I believe is going to play somewhat of a part in this too. And that being the Militia Immaculata. This battle will take place on a spiritual level. And though we will be small in number, us Knights of Christendom, we will win in the end. We just have to have that faith that it will. And whatever anybody else says around us, what they think they're going to do to fix things, or their lamentations because they don't know what to do, means nothing to us right now. We know what we have to do, and they're just going to have to wait and see, I think. So it's a matter of doing the best we can with what we got, where we're at, and trying to work our way towards being better Christians through Our Lady, praying for people, like when you're driving in traffic and somebody cuts you off, instead of flipping them the bird, say, God love that man, or Jesus, Mary, save souls. Turn it around. We've got to start turning it around at the spiritual level right now. And
Yeah.
that's what I think needs to be done.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Pete. I think it's a dark time, and I don't. It's frustrating if you're trying to raise a family in this culture, and you see all the elements of humanity failing. But that's why I think we Catholics, we have an added advantage. I know with me, I know chastisements are coming down the pipe. Our Lady said it, and I believe they've started in a lot of different ways, not just with COVID. I think the entire breakdown of the family over the past 50 years has been a great chastisement. But there's more coming down the pipe, in my opinion. And I think, just to close out this podcast here, you know, instead of always being doom and gloom here, I know you mentioned the great monarch. I know you mentioned the great restoration, and that's what Our Lady tells us. If you were advising people, Pete, how to move forward through these turbulent times, where do we find recourse in this dark era of human history, Pete?
With absolutely what I just said, through Our Lady, find it through her, and develop a devotion to the Sacred Heart. We have to start. We have to start internally. Each one of us. We have to rise up out of these feelings of, oh no, it's the end kind of thing, and we have to stand up and fight. We've got, like I said, we've got two things. We've got armor and we've got weapons. Our weapons are our prayers. Our armor is our fasting. I encourage everybody to fast. If you're a Protestant, try it. If you're a Catholic that doesn't do the meat thing on Friday, try doing the meat thing on Friday. If you're already doing the meat thing on Friday, do it on Wednesdays too, even Saturdays. Do more. Try and do as much more as you can. Pray when you're driving. Don't be preachy to people, but just do as much as you can from the inside out. And I think that's what's going to help. And if you are closing out right now, I just wanted to add one more prophecy, because I think this is actually really hopeful. I noticed that on December 29th of 2020, President Trump posted about St. Thomas Becket, making St. Thomas Becket a feast day, or something to that. I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was a big deal. While I was digging through these prophecies, I found a prophecy from St. Thomas of Becket, and he says that a knight shall come from the west. He shall capture Milan, Lombardy, and the Three Crowns. He shall then sail to Cyprus and Famagost and the land of Jaffa, and reach Christ's grave, where he will fight. Wars and wonders shall befall till the people believe in Christ toward the end of the world. I think that Pope Trump, sorry. I think that President Trump made a really timely remark about St. Thomas Becket on that day. I think is very important, and that I found this, I find is just really inspiring. And I hope that people seeing this are inspired by that too.